See, this is why I don't use GW paint pots, because everything just dries out immediately. I mean, it was ridiculous.
Vince, it says dry right on the bottle. It's supposed to be for dry brushing.
Well, that doesn't make it. Look, I just threw them all out, man. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Anyway, so what else are you working on?
I'm working on an Emperor's Champion.
Nice. Is that going to be for Golden Demon?
Probably. I've got to get everything ready to go. Got to keep my winning streak alive. Don't worry, John. You'll get there someday. You'll win one.
Oh, I'll get there someday, huh? Well, that's where this is going. You know what this means, don't you, Vince? High noon, internet, Dry Brush Showdown. Hello and welcome back, hobby friends. Recently I was chatting with a good buddy of mine, Vincey V, and we discovered we were both planning on doing a video where we painted a model using only dry brushes. We thought this was a great opportunity for us to see how we each approached this challenge differently and to determine who did it better. Spoiler, it's gonna be me. So why dry brushing? Good question. I'm glad you asked. Many people, myself included, have an unfounded negative perception of this technique, and that it's just a silly and simple way to quickly paint all of your terrain and big models, and it all ends up looking like crap and chalky and dusty. We look at these little brushes as something that doesn't require a lot of skill, and as we grow as painters, we assume that this low-level skill doesn't grow with us. But I'm going to put aside my biased opinion and very little experience using dry brushes and see if they actually warrant that negative opinion we have of them. And since I'm in no mood to lose a challenge to Vince without at least fighting dirty, I was hooked up with an amazing dry brush set called the Series D by Artist Opus, and they even gave me this fancy Ninja case. I'm sure its power will see me through, as well as something called a texture palette, which, as you can see, has additional magical properties. Vince, you stand no chance. I actually reached out to Artist Opus' own Byron, master dry brusher, dry brushian, dry brushist, after I had finished painting today's model. While this process was all fresh in my head, I wanted to pick his brain and figure out how he approaches dry brushing differently than I did. In hindsight, I should have talked to him before painting, so I would have for sure won. So throughout today's video, we're not only going to go over my process of painting a 32mm model using only a dry brush, but we're also going to learn about some of the tips that Byron gave me. So when you try this, it's probably going to turn out better than mine. I want to start by going over one of the factors that is most notorious for giving dry brushing a bad name, and that is in its name itself, dry brushing. You actually want some moisture on your brush for dry brushing, otherwise it ends up chalky and grainy. Think about it this way. If you remove all the moisture and medium from your brush and your paint, all you're left with is that dry, chalky pigment. And that's why you want to control the moisture of your brush by dampening it on a small sponge before you add paint to make sure there's still some moisture there. And then you wipe off and work in the paint on a hard, non-porous surface like a chipboard like this. Whenever you see somebody using a paper towel to work in the paint on the bristles or use it to remove some of the paint before going to the model, they're actually sucking that moisture out of the brush, which leads to a much worse and chalky dry brushing experience. Somewhere in the universe, Vince is wiping his dry brush on a paper towel right now. The next confusing thing is the name of the tool. Dry brush is the same name as a painting technique, dry brushing. It's important to note that dry brushes can actually do a lot of other things really well than just dry brushing. For example, smudging and stippling. To put a universal faint base coat across the entire model, I'm going to be smudging on Rhinox hide. Smudging requires you to do tight concentric circles with the brush, so the paint is being applied to the model at all angles. By doing this, I'm building up from black and giving us a nice deep brown to build all future colors off of. Plus, it keeps all the deepest recesses in that full black, so we have those nice darkest darks from the black primer. I could have gone over this whole model with multiple layers of this Rhinox hide to build up the opacity, and that's something I actually learned in this process. You want to be using your dry brushes similarly to how you use your standard brushes. You want to build things up gradually with layers. Oftentimes we think we do one quick hard pass with a dry brush over a surface and that's as good as it's going to get. That is in fact not how they work most effectively. I want this death guard to look properly grim and dark, and I know you're probably thinking that's just an excuse for me to paint it sloppily with a dry brush, and that's not my goal. I want to focus on big contrasts in light and dark and colors so we can feel like there's a lot of drama in the piece with the paint job. So from the get-go, I'm keeping in mind my light source and which surfaces of the model will catch more light as I build up color in those areas. And I've got to admit, I was kind of impressed with how the dry brush could achieve what I was going for as long as I was purposeful in where and how I placed the paint. After watching Byron show me his approach, I realized that I was often applying too much pressure with my brush here. And I think part of the reason why I was doing that is I wasn't using a big enough brush. You can have a surprising amount of control even with a large dry brush, and you can actually create a smoother overall result. I got to a certain point in the highlighting steps where I started to feel uncomfortable with the tool. I wasn't experienced enough with stippling with a larger dry brush, so I moved over to a tiny old ratty brush that I use for dry brush and stippling. And I actually did this way too soon. I think by forcing myself to practice the stippling with a smaller dry brush, I actually could have gotten a much smoother and nicer result. This little crapper didn't really offer me any more control at this stage, and its floppy bristles actually hindered me more than they helped. A firm bristled, bowl-shaped brush is meant to support itself no matter what angle you use it from. If the brush isn't firm, it gives way while you're trying to make a stroke, and it leads to less control, and it requires you to apply so much more pressure to get the paint off. Stippling is, at a basic level, just gently jabbing the tip of your brush across the surface of a model to create a series of irregular dots. Now, a nice firm bristled, slightly damp brush does this best, because if you have a floppy bristled brush, it's actually going to move off the side and deflect as it hits the model and create streaks and not just those dots. When I look back at the areas of the model that I'm not as happy with and things that I want to improve on for the next time, it came down to two main things: controlling the moisture and controlling how much paint I had on the brush. I didn't do a good job of keeping just a little bit of moisture on my brush, just enough to where it feels cool on the back of your hand. Because I didn't do this often enough, I often had to fight getting the paint off the bristles, and I didn't have as nice, smooth a result in some areas as I did in others. And I often made a pretty rookie mistake of not wiping off the correct amount of paint from my brush before I went to the model and testing it on my hand first. This led to an inconsistent amount of paint that was being delivered onto the model compared to what I was trying to do. So I had some areas that turned out well and other areas that were just a bit too heavy-handed. Byron asked if I rubbed the brush in concentric circles a bit before starting painting the model each time. And you know when people ask you a question and there's an answer you know they want to hear, so you just lie and tell them that answer? Today's video is brought to us by the #1 place that us creative types go to get our learn on, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for creators. Explore new skills, deepen existing passions, and go down the rabbit hole of artistic enlightenment. There's tons of applicable classes for our mini hobby. Artsy related things regarding color, light, and even artist productivity. One I'm excited to start is called Productivity for Creatives, building a system that brings out your best with Thomas Frank. Lord knows I struggle to make the most out of my hobby time. Skillshare is great because it's curated specifically for learning, meaning there's no ads, they're always launching new high-quality classes by people that know their stuff, and the classes are broken up into bite-sized chunks so you can learn whenever you have some free time, over lunch, on the toilet, on a hot air balloon ride, wherever. If you want to figure out if it's something that you would like or not, why don't you click on the link in the video description below and get a 1-month free trial. That way you can take her for a spin. But it's only open to the first 1,000 subscribers that click that link, so get on down there and enjoy your free trial. A big thank you to Skillshare for supporting the channel. Now let's get these minis put away and get back to the video. As I was finishing up the armor, I was kind of surprised and excited by a couple of realizations through this process. The first one was how awesome it was to build up depth of color up to even small details using only a dry brush. It made me really want to go back in and glaze in some more depth into the shadows and really make this armor pop even more. But I'm not about to get disqualified from this challenge for breaking the rules, so suck it, Vince. The other thing that shocked me was how little time it took me to get the armor to this level. It took me probably 1/4 or less of the time as it would have if I did my standard layering technique on the armor. As we start making all the metals rusty on this Plague Marine, I want to share with you a gut-sinking feeling that I had when I was roughly halfway through this model. I realized that in the video I'd be showing off the fancy dry brushes and dry brush case and that people might be interested in getting one, but Byron just made one and sent it to me, so they don't exist. So about 5 days ago, I reached out to Byron and kind of asked him nicely if he could make a small run of these in case anybody wanted to buy one. And surprisingly, he said yes. They're going to make a limited run of 100 Slay the Gray edition brush cases for their Series D set, as well as texture palettes. So if you wanted to support the channel, now on Black Friday, you can go out to the link below and pick up your own Ninja Slay the Gray limited run Series D Artist Opus set. They're only going to be up for order for a 2-week period, so grab them while you can. And also, they're actually going to be a cooler set than this one. Byron says he's going to include the 5th brush, the extra large, which he says is his favorite, as well as some very interesting extra goodies that will be supplied in your package when it hits your doorstep. Okay, back to this rusty metal. I want to make sure to keep a high level of contrast across all the metals. Some of that pure Rhinox hide should still be showing through with big jumps in brighter colors and small dots and splotches. To add some depth to the armor and create a starting point for glints of metal shown underneath, I stipple on pure black paint in some random spots. Again, I should have used a bigger standard dry brush for this, not some old floppy brush. I ended up making spots of black that were too big, and they weren't tiny flecks and not as irregular as I was hoping for. But coming back through with a few dots of pure white to represent that glint of metal shining through the cracked rust did add a nice little detail, and again, just used the same stippling approach. This is one of the few times where using a tiny old brush to put on just a few dots was actually the right tool for the job. When I was first looking at this model, thinking how I was going to paint it with only a dry brush, I looked at the lenses and assumed that was going to turn out terribly. There's no way I could get them to look as nice as I do with glazes to build up the glow on the top and bottom of the lens. But when I kept the brush slightly damp and worked in focused, gentle stippling motions over the top and bottom rim of the lenses, it naturally faded and created a surprisingly realistic transition. I mean, I guess that kind of makes sense. On tiny details of color, building it up with tiny transparent dots over a number of layers works very similarly to the way we use glazing and blending traditionally. Then, just a small dot of white in the top right corner for each lens sells the effect as a reflective surface. One thing I learned from Byron is that he typically starts with a stippling motion over the majority of the area he wants that color. He then comes back through with that same color and either does a smudging or a dry brushing, and this kind of blends that full color with all the areas around it. And looking back on how I painted the Nurgling, that approach that Byron uses would probably have served me better here. I kind of just did an all-over paint from the very get-go instead of really establishing nice, firm, opaque colors that will really build up the vibrancy in this weird little Pinkie Pie Nurgling. But I'm not totally mad how it turned out. He does seem a little bit more dark and sinister, fits the grim dark vibe of the overall piece and the Marine itself. So I'm just going to say this was working as intended, and I wanted it to look like this the whole time. We usually think of dry brushing as building up lighter and lighter colors to pick out more and brighter highlights. So I did get a little bit nervous about how it was going to look when I tried to go darker on the horns for the Plague Marine and the Nurgling. The transition came out just as smooth as when I build up with brighter colors, which made me wonder if I could have done some other cool things on the model by selectively going darker with interesting colors and then maybe even building back up again later. And that's a great thing about this process. It took me about 2 hours to paint this entire model start to finish. So if I want to test something new, I want to try out a different technique within the dry brush realm, I haven't taken much time to get it to this point. So that ability to experiment that usually kind of feels like a hurdle didn't feel like so much of one with this. And if at this point you're not at least excited to try implementing more dry brushing into your mini painting, let's take a look at a work in progress photo by David Soper, one of the greatest miniature painters alive. This arm was entirely built up from dry brushing as its base and initial color layout. Okay, yeah, obviously he did other amazing work on top of that foundation, but don't focus on that, my point still stands. Even if you don't really use much dry brushing, you probably have used it to pick out details on your basing before, so there's nothing new or exciting here. But stippling on some dry pigments on your base is a great way to integrate dry brushing and add a bunch of interest and depth to your models. And I'm sure Vince forgot to do this on his. So you should head over to his video, I'll link it down below, and let him know in the comments that he failed on the pigment thing. And if he did do it, tell him his butt stinks. So a big thank you for hanging out today and going through this miniature exploratory surgery with me. I gotta say I was quite impressed and a bit overwhelmed by how deep the dry brushing ocean is in our miniature hobby. It was surprisingly satisfying. And when I think about why, there was 2 things that really worked together for me to really enjoy this. First of all, I was able to see results much quicker than I usually do when I'm painting laboriously to build up layers on a model. And second, I was trying a different tool, a different technique, and figuring things out and thinking of ways that I could do it better next time. Oh, I almost forgot. 'Tis the season for Black Friday sales, and this video is dropping on Black Friday, so I didn't want to be left out. I decided to offer 15% off everything on my merchandise site. So if you want to get a gift for yourself or somebody else you love, you can do it now. That sale goes through December 10th. Just enter the coupon code NinjonBF21 so you can get yourself a coffee mug, shirts and hoodies, pint glass, sweet stickers, poster. You can also support me on Patreon, which is the most reliable way I have to now keep the bills paid. And you get some fun rewards for joining the Ninjon Dojo. So check out that link in the video description below. A big thank you to my patrons to ensure more videos keep getting made. So until next week, grab a dry brush, start poking, finish stroking, and slay the gray.
Couldn't get the fucking thing off.
That's exactly the problem.
To the model to create slippery brush 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 brush. Okay, just had a stroke.